For decades, we've basically heard one thing over and over: eating beef is bad for the planet. But what if that's not the whole picture? Today, we're going to dig into a source that makes a really bold, really challenging case for cattle farming. All right, let's get into it.
So this is the claim right at the heart of our source material from author Samoa Hule. I mean, wow. It's an idea that just flies in the face of everything we've been told, arguing that cattle aren't just part of our ecosystem, they're absolutely essential to it.
And let's be honest, this is the message we all know, right? It's been in countless articles, documentaries, you name it. So right there, you have the central conflict we're exploring today: the mainstream view versus this radical counterargument. Okay, so following our source's lead, let's put cattle on trial. We're going to start with the number one charge leveled against them: their impact on the climate. This is the number. You've probably seen it thrown around a lot. It comes from a major UN report, and it says that livestock are responsible for about 14% of all human-caused greenhouse gases. And you can see why it's so powerful. It's a huge figure, and it's really the bedrock of the whole case against beef. But here's where our source really starts to push back. It argues that this big global number is kind of misleading because it averages out all kinds of different farming systems. So let's just zoom in on the UK, for example. The author points out that emissions from cattle and sheep there are just 5.7%. And then, when you factor in the carbon that the pasture itself soaks up, that number drops all the way down to 3.7%. I mean, that is a world away from that global 14% figure. Now, the source makes a scientific distinction here that is absolutely critical to its whole argument. It says that methane, the main gas from cattle, is a flow gas. So what does that mean? Well, unlike CO2, it doesn't just stick around forever accumulating. It's actually part of a really fast natural cycle. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. Think of it this way. The methane from a cow hangs out in the atmosphere for about 12 years. Then it breaks down and gets reabsorbed by plants, which the cow then eats, and the cycle begins all over again. Now compare that to CO2 from burning fossil fuels, which can stay up there for 100 years or more, just piling up and up and up. One's a cycle, the other's an addition. A huge difference. So, to quickly recap the emissions question, the source argues that once you understand methane is in a cycle and you look at local data, the climate case against cattle looks a lot weaker than we thought. But of course, that's just one piece of the puzzle. What about how cattle use our planet's other resources, like land and water? We hear all the time that livestock take up too much land. And yeah, you look at a chart like this and you see a huge chunk of agricultural land is used for grazing. But here's the author's crucial point. 2/3 of that land is what you'd call marginal land. That means it's too rocky or too steep, or the soil is too poor to grow crops, so it can only be used for grazing. And what about water? We've all seen these shocking statistics, right? 39 bathtubs for 1 pound of beef? That just sounds insane. It definitely paints a picture of beef production being incredibly thirsty. But again, the source says, hold on, we need more context here. It introduces the difference between green water, which is basically just rain that falls on pastures, and blue water, which is the stuff we have to pull from rivers and aquifers. And here's the kicker. The author claims over 90% of the water used for beef is just that renewable green water, all part of the natural water cycle. So, if we only look at the non-renewable blue water footprint, the story completely flips. According to the data in the source, producing a kilogram of beef uses about 93 liters. Now look at almonds, over 5,000 liters. It's a comparison that's clearly designed to totally reframe the whole water debate. So the source makes a powerful case on resource use, basically arguing that cattle are perfectly suited for the land they're on and that their water footprint is totally misunderstood. So this leads us to the next logical question. What are we actually getting in the final product? Let's take a closer look at the beef itself. Shoppers worry a lot about grain-fed versus grass-fed beef. Well, the author clarifies that, in a system like the UK's, pretty much all cattle spend the vast majority of their lives on pasture eating grass. The only difference is right at the very end, for the last few months, when they're finished on either grass or some grain to fatten them up. The source also tackles those consumer fears about hormones and antibiotics. It points out that in places like the UK, growth hormones have been banned for decades. And while, antibiotics are used to keep animals healthy, their use has dropped a lot, and there are super strict rules to make sure they don't enter the food supply. Okay, so what about the nutritional difference? Green finishing often gets a bad rap for increasing inflammatory omega-6 fats.
But the source presents this chart, and it really puts things into perspective. Sure, green finished beef has a little more omega-6, but the amount is tiny compared to other foods like pork belly or even walnuts. The argument is that the difference is so small, it's pretty much insignificant.
So, according to the source, many of the big concerns about how cattle are raised and what's actually in the final product are, well, maybe a little misplaced. And this reframing of all the negatives leads us directly to the author's ultimate argument that cattle aren't just not bad, they are actively good for the environment. And this is the positive case. It's not just about defending cattle, it's about seeing them as a vital part of a regenerative system. They're natural upcyclers, turning grass we can't eat into nutrient-dense food. Their grazing actually helps the soil sequester or store more carbon. Their manure is a natural fertilizer. And by doing all this, they sustain these vital grassland habitats that thousands of other species need to survive.
And this brings us full circle, right back to the author's core thesis, but stated even more powerfully now. After looking at all the evidence, the source concludes that cattle are, in fact, a key solution for a sustainable food system.
So the final verdict from our source is in, and it's a complete 180 from the common narrative we started with. So the source material we've explored today makes the case that cattle are not an environmental liability, but a regenerative asset. It's a provocative and challenging perspective, for sure. So the final question for us to think about is this: does this kind of argument change how we should be talking about the future of sustainable food?